All right, welcome back behind the demand curve consumer choice. So welcome to Unit 2. We're going to look at income effects and substitution effects. All right, in this video we'll learn why exactly the demand curve is downward sloping, again building on stuff from Unit 1, as well as why the substitution effect and income effect actually cause that phenomenon to take place. All right, so to review back from Unit 1, we talked about the law of demand, which is restated here for your convenience. A higher price, all other things being equal, leads to a decrease in the quantity demanded. So we have become proficient at this in Unit 1 already at this point. So looking here on the right side, we have a movement from A to B. The price has gone from $20 to $21, and as a result of that, we see a decrease in the quantity, in this case of vaccinations that are being demanded, from 10 million down to 9.9. If that movement happened the other way, lowering the price from B to A, we would have seen an increase in the demand, or the quantity demanded for vaccinations. All right, so what exactly causes this? Well, there's two reasons. We have the substitution effect on this side, and the next one will be the income effect. So substitution effect is the change in the quantity of a good demanded as the consumer substitutes the good has become relatively cheaper for the good that has become relatively more expensive, blah, blah, blah. All right, so you have all those words there. That's good. What is this really saying? Well, what really matters is the relative price of things that you would use to substitute one good for another. So on the right side, I put two goods, a hamburger and a grilled chicken sandwich. So for most people, those would be substitutes. So if we have a change in the price of the hamburger, let's say that the hamburger becomes more expensive, well, we know we're going to have an upward movement along the demand curve for hamburgers, causing us to demand a smaller quantity of hamburgers. Now, why? The key thing is because we can change what we buy. We don't have to buy as many hamburgers. Instead of buying hamburgers, since they have become relatively more expensive, we can now buy more chicken sandwiches, which the price hasn't changed for grilled chicken sandwiches, but it has become relatively cheaper. So this idea is something we talked about in Unit 1, but this is just the vocab term for it now. Because one has gotten relatively cheaper, we continuously substitute towards the cheaper good and away from the good that is relatively more expensive. So that's going to cause us to have this upward movement when the price increases, or a downward movement and increase our quantity demanded when the price drops. So again, that's the main explanation for why our demand curve is downward sloping, is this right here, the substitution effect. We substitute away from the relatively expensive good in favor of the relatively cheaper good. Now there is another reason, and it's the income effect. Now this is what's happening is when the price goes up on something, I'm not going to read you the definition, you have it there to copy. But when the price goes up on something, remember, our income hasn't changed. We still have the same amount of money. So let's say we make, just making the numbers up, we make $400 a week. Now the price of a vaccination that used to be $20 is now $21. That means that the $400 that we had, or that we have now, it doesn't buy us as much as it did before. When the price of that vaccine was only $20 compared to when it's now $21, our money doesn't buy us as much anymore. So we have lost purchasing power, and that's known as the income effect. So this is going to cause us, again, to change our quantity demanded. So it works the same way here, a substitution in this case. Because the price has gone up from 20 to 21, we're going to demand a smaller quantity of, in this case, vaccines, because it has reduced our purchasing power overall, because we cannot buy as much now as we could before. This is the income effect. All right, so we have a vocab term here, real income, which is going to become much more important when we get to macroeconomics. But for now, real income is income that is adjusted to reflect its true purchasing power. So again, macro, we're going to get into this in a lot more detail. The idea, if you think about it, because of inflation throughout time, we know that prices go up. So for instance, if I were to tell you that somebody earned $10 an hour in 1970, would we really know how much that is today? Like, would we be able to have an idea of what exactly they could buy with that $10 an hour? The answer is probably not, unless we made it real income, because we have to adjust it to show what can you actually buy with that amount of money. So real income, that's a way of essentially controlling for inflation, where we just compare how much does it cost to actually buy things. So we're looking at purchasing power. Like I said, though, that's going to be a lot more important in macroeconomics. All right, so I already said this. Number one, so we have three things we're going to talk about here comparing these two effects. One is that most goods and services, the market demand curve is downward sloping solely because of the substitution effect. So because we are able to substitute for the relatively cheaper good and away from the relatively more expensive good, that is what causes our demand curve to be downward sloping the vast majority of the time. So what's the income effect? Well, it merely reinforces the substitution effect for normal goods, meaning that it's going to cause a movement in the same direction. So as we saw, when the price of the vaccination goes up, we demand a smaller quantity of vaccinations because of both the substitution and the income effect, even though it is primarily the result of the income effect, the substitution effect. There is an exception, and that's for inferior goods. And we'll work on this in class. I'll show you this a little bit more detail. For inferior goods, these effects work in opposite directions. Because remember, the weird thing about inferior goods is that when our income decreases, we actually buy more of them, right? So in this case, when the price goes up, it's making us have less purchasing power, which makes us poorer, which would suggest that we should actually buy more inferior goods because of the income effect. However, that's not the case. The substitution effect dominates the income effect, and we actually substitute away from that particular inferior good and we get something else instead. So this is the one exception where the income and substitution effect don't actually move together in the same direction, but when that happens, the substitution effect is the stronger of the two. This has been a LaMoney production.